The sun had just dipped behind the low hills of Kentucky, leaving a streak of pale orange across the gray sky. An autumn breeze rustled through the dry cornfields, carrying the whisper of brittle husks and the scent of damp earth. Emma Summers stood in front of the old barn, hands on her hips, sweat trailing down her forehead despite the chilly air. She wore a worn-out flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled high and boots caked with mud. At 35, Emma wasn't the kind of person who gave up easily, but this barn was testing every ounce of her patience. "Ethan, are you sure this floor's not going to give out on us?" she called, her voice slightly hoarse from the dust. She had just pried up a rotted plank with a crowbar, revealing decaying wood beneath. The barn, along with a log cabin a few hundred feet away, was part of the 80-acre farm she'd bought 2 years ago. It was a bold move, driven by her dream of building a self-sustaining organic homestead. But now, reality was hitting hard. Everything was old, broken, and in desperate need of fixing. Ethan stepped out from the far corner of the barn, holding a hammer and a small flashlight. He was tall, tousle-haired, and wore a faded denim jacket. "If it collapses," he said with a half-smile, "let's just hope it waits until we finish clearing all this junk." Ethan wasn't a farmer or an engineer, but he knew enough about wiring and machinery to be a huge help these past few months. He and Emma had been friends since college, and when she called asking for help with the farm, he didn't hesitate to drive out from Louisville. They'd spent the entire day cleaning out the barn. Moldy coils of rope, splintered wooden crates, and a few rusted plow blades left behind by the previous owner. Emma wanted to turn the place into a seed and tool shed, but first the whole floor had to go. "At least it's free exercise," she muttered to herself, even though her arms were starting to ache. "Hand me the crowbar," Ethan said, walking over. He knelt down and pried up another plank. The wood cracked and splintered, leaving a wide hole. Dust filled the air, making them both cough. Emma used her sleeve to cover her nose, grimacing. "I swear there's a dead rat under there," she mumbled. But when the dust settled, what they saw wasn't a dead animal or trash. A flat, rusted metal plate appeared beneath the rotted floor. It was partially embedded in the ground, clearly something that didn't belong in an old farm barn. Emma and Ethan exchanged glances, both surprised. "What the heck is that?" Ethan asked, his voice dropping like he was afraid someone might overhear. Emma knelt down and brushed off the dirt coating the metal surface. A small steel handle appeared, along with some old welding seams. "Looks like a hatch," she said slowly, her mind racing. She'd read about old Prohibition-era moonshine cellars, but this thing looked far too solid, like it had been built for something serious. "Maybe the old owner built it," Ethan offered, though he didn't sound convinced. He tapped the plate with his hammer's handle. It gave off a deep, heavy thunk. "That's no moonshine hideout." Emma grabbed the handle and gave it a pull. It didn't budge. "Stuck," she muttered, then looked at Ethan. "Help me out?" He nodded, set the hammer down, and grabbed the handle alongside her. They pulled hard together. A high-pitched screech echoed as the rusted metal broke free, and the hatch creaked open, revealing a gaping darkness below. A wave of cold, damp air surged up, carrying the sharp tang of metal and something that smelled faintly like old chemicals. Emma stepped back, her heart thudding. "Do you smell that?" she asked. Ethan nodded, wrinkling his nose. "Smells like my dad's old repair garage, but stronger." He flicked on his flashlight and aimed it downward. The dim beam revealed a set of metal stairs, leading into the pitch-black unknown. Neither of them said anything for a moment. The only sound was the wind whistling through the gaps in the barn wall. "Going down?" Ethan asked, half joking, half serious. Emma glanced at him, then back at the gaping hole in the floor. She wasn't superstitious, but something about that pit sent a chill down her spine. Still, curiosity, the same drive that had pushed her to leave a research job in the city and buy this farm, was stirring again. "Bring a stronger light," she said. "I'm not going down there blind." Ethan jogged to the truck and came back with a bigger flashlight and a short coil of rope. "Just in case we need to pull each other out," he said, looping it around Emma's waist before she could protest. She scoffed but didn't take it off. Then she stepped onto the first metal stair, gripping the rusted handrail. The metal felt ice cold under her palm, and with every step down, the air grew heavier. After about 10 steps, her boots landed on solid ground. Ethan followed close behind, sweeping the flashlight across the space. The beam revealed gray concrete walls, thick with dust and spiderwebs. In one corner stood a chest-high steel cabinet with a broken lock. Beside it was a metal work table, cluttered with strange items: shattered test tubes, a gauge with a frozen needle, and a thick stack of yellowed papers buried in dust. But what made Emma stop in her tracks was the faded writing on the wall. Ethan aimed the flashlight at it, and they read the words together: USDOD, Redwood Project. The DOD was deeply etched, clearly the U.S. Department of Defense. But the words Redwood Project were smeared, like someone had tried to scrub them out. Emma felt her throat tighten. "Military? Under my farm?" she whispered, more to herself than to Ethan. Ethan stepped towards the cabinet and pulled it open. Inside were several thick folders, the covers marked with odd numbers and cryptic codes. He flipped one open, but the paper was so brittle it tore in his hands. "Looks like some kind of mini-lab," he said, a hint of excitement in his voice. "You think they were testing weapons down here?" Emma shook her head, her mind spinning. "Doesn't smell like gunpowder. It's more like chemical reagents." She'd worked in a university lab before, and the scent brought back memories of old solvents and test kits. But why here, buried under a remote farm in Kentucky? She stepped over to the table and picked up a slip of paper that had fallen from the stack. The handwriting was messy, and most of the words were faded, but a few stood out. Experiment, output, sealed 1975. "Emma, you okay?" Ethan asked, noticing how long she'd gone silent. She nodded, though her hand was clenched around the note. "I don't know," she said quietly. "But I don't like the smell down here. Let's go up. I'll come back tomorrow with gloves and a mask." They climbed the stairs and closed the hatch behind them, but the unease stuck with Emma. That night, lying on the old bed in the log cabin, she couldn't sleep. The wind outside seemed to carry whispers from underground. She kept wondering, what the hell is buried under my farm? And maybe more importantly, did she really want to find out? The next morning, just as the sun began to rise over the dry cornfields, Emma was already sitting in the tiny kitchen of the log cabin, clutching a mug of strong black coffee. She hadn't slept more than an hour. Her mind kept circling back to the hatch under the barn, to the eerie smell, and the words USDOD, Redwood Project, echoing in her head like a riddle with no answer. She wasn't one for conspiracy theories, but whatever that underground lab was, it sure as hell wasn't built to store potatoes. Ethan showed up early, knocking once before letting himself in with a paper bag of bread rolls and a couple energy bars. "You look like you saw a ghost," he said, setting the bag on the table. Emma gave a tired half-smile, sliding her coffee aside. "Not a ghost, just that hatch. I can't stop thinking about it." "Then stop thinking about it," Ethan said, settling into the chair across from her. "Today we go back down, with the safety gear like you said." but I'm betting it's just old paperwork, and maybe a dead rat or two. He tried to sound casual, but Emma caught the flicker of curiosity in his eyes. He wanted to know what was down there, too, even if he wouldn't admit it. She nodded, stood up, and pulled an N95 mask and a pair of rubber gloves from the first aid kit. I'm not going down there again until I know we're not breathing in something toxic, but first I want to find out more. What exactly is the Redwood Project? And why is it under my farm? Ethan shrugged. Who are you gonna ask? The neighbors? Closest one's 3 miles away? But Emma already had an idea. The county library, she said. They've got old records, local papers, and land deed archives. If that bunker's connected to the government, there's gotta be some trace of it. An hour later, Emma was driving her old pickup into the nearest town, about 20 minutes from the farm. The county library sat inside a weathered red brick building, its windows smudged with dust, and a faded sign that read, Grayson County Library. Inside, the air smelled faintly of moldy paper and polished wood. An elderly woman with silver hair and thick glasses sat at the front desk. She looked up as Emma stepped in. Hello there, the woman rasped. Looking for a book? Not exactly, Emma replied with a polite smile. I'm looking for old records, land deeds, maybe government projects in this area around the 1970s. The woman raised an eyebrow, but didn't press further. Records are in the basement. Follow me. The library basement didn't feel anything like the one under Emma's barn. It was well lit, with rows of metal shelves stacked with document boxes and reels of microfilm. The woman pointed toward the back. Land deeds are over there. Old newspapers are on the microfilm machine. You're on your own. I don't do stairs more than once a day. Emma thanked her and got to work. It took nearly 2 hours to scroll through the reels of local newspapers from the 1970s. Most of it was small-town chatter. Corn prices rising, a minor flood, harvest festivals. But then she found it. A short article from the Grayson County Gazette, dated October 12, 1975. The headline read, Government Project Cancelled? The article itself was only a few lines long. Rumors of a research facility near the Grayson area have spread, but officials declined to comment. A source claims the project was abruptly terminated earlier this year, reason unknown. Emma jotted down the date and moved on to the land records. She looked up her farm's plot. Lot 47, Old Mill Road. The previous owner was someone named Harold Grayson, who held the property from 1962 to 1980. Nothing unusual, except a small note in the 1976 transfer document. Site inspected by federal representative. No violations found. Emma frowned. Inspected for what? She returned to the front desk, where the old woman was now flipping through a newspaper. Ma'am, do you remember anything about a government project around here, back in '75? The woman set the paper down and peered over her glasses. 1975? I vaguely remember. A few strangers in suits came poking around, asking questions about land. Then one day they were just gone. Folks said they were building some kind of shelter or something, but no one really knew. Why do you ask? Emma hesitated. I found something strange under my barn. The old woman gave a dry chuckle. This land's full of secrets. But if it's government business, best not to dig too deep, young lady. The warning was gentle, but it sent a shiver down Emma's spine. On the way back, she stopped at a hardware store to pick up more masks, gloves, and a can of disinfectant spray. Ethan was already waiting at the farm, sitting on the barn steps with a can of soda in hand. Find anything? He asked as she stepped out of the truck. Emma told him everything she'd found, from the newspaper article to the note about Harold Grayson. I think that bunker is part of the Redwood Project the article mentioned. Could have been a military project, shut down in 1975. But why leave it buried here? Ethan shrugged. Maybe they figured no one would ever find it, or they just forgot. Who forgets an underground lab? Emma shot back. She pulled out the scrap of paper from the night before and pointed to the words, sealed 1975. It lines up with the date in the article, but I need to know more. If this was a Department of Defense project, what could have been so dangerous they had to seal it off? Ethan stood and brushed the dust off his jeans. Then let's head back down. With the gear this time. We check everything properly, and if it's really dangerous, we call the cops. Emma nodded, though deep down she doubted the local sheriff would know what to do with a buried government secret. They returned to the barn and pried open the hatch again. This time both wore masks, gloves, and carried larger flashlights. The air below was still cold and heavy with the chemical stench, but Emma was more prepared for it now. She walked over to the steel cabinet and pulled out one of the better-preserved folders. The label read, Redwood 3, Preliminary Report, 1974. Inside were typewritten pages, some with graphs and scribbled annotations. She flipped to the first page and read aloud, Project Redwood 3, funded by the Department of Defense, in collaboration with DARC Labs. Objective: develop high-yield, drought-resistant crop strains for military use. Emma paused and looked at Ethan. Crops? They built an entire underground lab just to test plants? Ethan raised an eyebrow. Sounds like science fiction stuff, but if it's military, I doubt it was that simple. Emma turned more pages, but many had been redacted or cut out completely. Only fragments remained. Initial trial successful. Environmental complications. Termination order, March 15th, 1975. Environmental complications, she repeated, voice low. Maybe that's why they sealed it off. But why leave everything behind? She set the folder down and scanned the room. If Redwood 3 was about crops, what were the test tubes and machines for? And who exactly was DARC Labs? She didn't have the answers yet, but one thing was clear. That bunker wasn't as harmless as Ethan had hoped. I'm keeping these files, she said, clutching the papers to her chest. Tomorrow we go back down and see what else is down here, but I have a feeling Redwood 3 left something behind that the government didn't want anyone finding. Ethan nodded, though worry crept into his eyes. As they climbed out and shut the hatch, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that she'd stepped into something much bigger than her dream of an organic farm. The next morning, Emma woke with a weight in her chest, as if the air in the old log cabin had thickened overnight. She sat at the kitchen table, the Redwood 3 folder lying in front of her, its yellowed pages still as silent and unreadable as the night before. She had read and reread the section about environmental complications and dark labs, but nothing clearly linked the lab to her farm. Outside, birds chirped in the distance, and the wind rustled the dry corn. But in Emma's mind, everything felt tangled. She knew she needed more answers, but something deep inside told her. That bunker wasn't just a forgotten relic of the past. Ethan showed up just after sunrise, holding a box of donuts from town, and wearing a look that was equal parts curiosity and concern. "Did you get any sleep?" he asked, setting the box on the table and pulling out a chair across from her. Emma shook her head and slid the folder toward him. "Not really. I kept thinking about this DARC Labs. Who are they? And why was the Department of Defense working with them on crop research?" Ethan shrugged, grabbing a donut and taking a bite before replying. "Probably some private contractor. Back during the Cold War, they did all kinds of weird stuff. But if the project got shut down, why are you still so spooked? Emma frowned, tapping her fingers on the table. Because they didn't clean it up, Ethan. If it was just about growing plants, why leave a whole lab buried underground? I feel like there's something bigger here. He nodded, though he didn't look completely convinced, and stood to grab a glass of water from the sink. So what now? Gonna dig up more old files? Emma didn't get a chance to answer before a low, unfamiliar engine sound rolled in from the yard, quieter, smoother than the usual rumble of a neighbor's pickup. She jumped to her feet and pulled back the curtain. A sleek black SUV had parked right outside the farm gate. The driver's door opened, and a man stepped out. He wore a gray utility jacket and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. In his hand was a small toolkit. Emma narrowed her eyes and turned to Ethan. Did you call someone to fix anything? Ethan shook his head, setting his water down and moving beside her. Nope. Who is that? The man walked toward the gate, raising his hand in a wave that felt a little too rehearsed. Good morning. I'm John, from the County Power Company. Got a report there might be a line issue out here, just here to check things out. His voice was smooth, but there was something off, like he was reading from a script. Emma opened the front door but kept her hand on the knob, ready to slam it shut if needed. I didn't report anything, she said coolly. Power's been just fine. John smiled, though it never reached his eyes. Ah, sometimes we get alerts from the system, not customers. Mind if I check around the barn? Won't take long. Ethan leaned in from behind her and whispered, You think it's weird? We find that bunker yesterday, and today a random technician shows up? Emma gave a slight nod, unease rising in her chest. She looked at John, trying to stay calm. That won't be necessary. Everything's working fine. Thanks for stopping by. John shrugged, but his gaze flicked to the barn. Too quickly, too deliberately, like he already knew where to look. All right then. But if anything comes up, just give the office a call. He turned and walked back to his SUV, but Emma noticed him pulling out a phone, quietly speaking into it before driving off. As the SUV disappeared down the dirt road, Ethan exhaled. I'd bet money that guy's not with the power company. Emma locked the door behind them. Me too. Someone knows we found the bunker, and they're trying to confirm it. But who? She didn't have the answer. Not yet. But the visit had only strengthened her resolve to dig deeper. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away, at the headquarters of Greenwood, a leading biotech corporation in Virginia, a middle-aged man sat in a glass-walled office, gazing down at the city through a massive window. Morrison, 50 years old, deputy director of internal security at Greenwood, was the kind of man people called when a situation needed to be cleaned up quietly. The kind of man who made problems disappear before they reached the press, or a courtroom. In front of him, the computer screen displayed a land deed for the property Emma Summers had bought 2 years ago, along with a short field report from John. She didn't say much, no confirmation yet. Morrison tapped his fingers on the desk, his gray eyes narrowing with practiced coldness. Greenwood wasn't a stranger to those who knew the history behind Dark Labs, the company's predecessor and a longtime contractor of the Pentagon, involved in sensitive programs like Redwood 3. When Dark was absorbed and rebranded in the 1980s, they'd scrubbed most of their past, or tried to. But Morrison knew better. Not everything had been recovered. Redwood 3, with its promise of ultra-high-yield, drought-resistant crops, had once been seen as a potential golden goose, until environmental complications forced the DoD to pull the plug. Some materials, along with specimen samples, had been sealed on site. One of those sites, it turned out, was now under Emma's farm. Morrison didn't know exactly what she'd found, but the fact she'd started renovating the barn, the structure hiding the hatch, was cause for concern. Greenwood couldn't allow that secret to surface, not because of any moral concern or environmental risk, but because of the enormous profit Redwood 3 might still hold if the technology could be recovered. He picked up the phone and called his assistant. "Keep a close eye on Summers. I want updates on her every move. If she's found the hatch, I need to know. Immediately." He hung up, eyes locked on the screen. John was only the first step, a scout disguised as an electric technician to sniff out the situation. But if Emma refused to cooperate, Morrison already had contingencies in place. He'd cleaned up worse: bribes, threats, even permanent silence if needed. At Greenwood, profit always came before ethics, and Redwood 3 was something they couldn't afford to lose. He stood, walked to the corner liquor cabinet, and poured a glass of whiskey. As he took a sip, his mind was already working through the next moves. If Emma Summers knew too much, she'd be given a choice: hand over everything and walk away with a payout, or face consequences she wouldn't survive. Back at the farm, Emma and Ethan had no idea they were already being watched. That every word they spoke, every step they took, was being monitored from miles away. After John drove off, Emma returned to the kitchen table and opened the Redwood 3 folder again, determined to uncover more. She didn't notice the tiny listening device tucked into the corner of the livestock shed, now transmitting every word straight to Morrison's office. "We should bring this stuff into the house," Emma said, clutching the file. "If Dark Labs is still around, I need to know who they are." Ethan nodded, though his eyes were still uneasy. "Be careful. I didn't like that electric guy one bit." Emma gave a dry smile, trying to hide her own unease. "Me neither. But I'm not backing down." She didn't know that, hundreds of miles away in Virginia, Morrison was listening and smiling. He had all the confirmation he needed, and Greenwood wouldn't let Emma Summers get in the way. That afternoon, a thick blanket of gray clouds hung low over Kentucky, making the air on the farm feel heavier than usual. Emma stood at the edge of the barn hatch, gripping a large flashlight. Her N95 mask was snug against her face, rubber gloves tight over fingers worn thin with worry. Beside her, Ethan tightened the rope around his waist, his expression cautious and alert after the morning's technician incident. They hadn't said much since John left, but the silence between them was heavy, charged with the unspoken knowledge that something unseen was creeping closer. "You sure about this?" Ethan asked, his voice muffled through the mask as he checked the knot securing the rope to a support beam. Emma nodded, even though her heart was pounding faster than usual. "I need to know what's down there. If Redwood 3 is dangerous, we can't just leave it buried forever." Ethan didn't argue. He simply clicked on his flashlight and gave her a nod to go first. They descended the rusted metal stairs, each step echoing sharply in the dark, cold air of the underground chamber. The chemical scent was still strong, but Emma had grown used to it. This time she focused on every detail her light touched: the stained concrete walls, the silent steel cabinet, the work table cluttered with broken instruments. She headed to the cabinet first, tugging the door open with a soft creak. Her flashlight beam fell on a thick folder buried in the back. She pulled it out. The label read, Redwood 3, Test Phase 1974 to 1975. She flipped through the pages, typed reports interspersed with scribbled notes in shaky handwriting. "Listen to this," she said, her voice trembling slightly, more from excitement than fear. It says, "Genetically modified corn trials showed yield increases of 300% with superior drought resistance. However, further study needed on genetic stability." 300%, Ethan. Can you imagine that? Ethan stepped closer, leaning over her shoulder, his light shining onto the yellowed page. Sounds like magic. But if it worked that well, why cancel it? Emma kept flipping until she landed on a heavily blacked-out section. Only a few words were legible. Uncontrolled crossbreeding, genetic contamination. She frowned, setting the file down and glancing toward the shattered glass vials on the table, some still lined with a dried greenish residue. Maybe it wasn't stable, she murmured. If it crossbred with wild plants, it could have destroyed entire ecosystems. Ethan nodded, but his attention had shifted to a dusty corner of the room. Something metal glinted faintly under the beam of his flashlight. Emma, over there, he said, stepping over and crouching. He pulled out a small metal box, heavier than it looked. The rusted lid bore faint engraved lettering. Redwood 3 seeds, experimental samples. 1974. Beneath that, nearly unreadable instructions, and a bold red warning. Incomplete. Mutation risk. Emma dropped the papers and rushed to his side, heart pounding as Ethan carefully lifted the lid. Inside were 3 clear plastic packets, each containing about a dozen dark brown seeds, slightly larger than normal corn kernels, with a strange waxy sheen that shimmered under the light. "Oh my God," Emma whispered, reaching out before stopping short. "Are they still viable, or dangerous?" Ethan closed the lid, his face suddenly serious. "I don't know, but I don't like that mutation warning. Don't plant them, Emma. If this stuff's unstable, you won't be able to control what happens." She nodded, though her mind was racing with questions. These seeds were the legacy of Redwood 3, a military dream turned environmental threat. She took the box from Ethan, feeling its weight, then returned to the table for the remaining documents. "Let's take everything back to the house," she said. "I need time to study this before we decide what to do." They climbed out, sealed the hatch, and carried the contents back to the log cabin, laying them across the kitchen table between cold coffee and stacks of paper. Emma flipped open the test file again, eyes scanning for anything that might explain what Dark Labs and the Department of Defense had truly done. A page near the end made her freeze. Primary concern. Redwood 3 seeds demonstrate potential for cross-pollination with wild flora, posing irreversible genetic contamination. Recommendation: destroy all samples and seal facility. The last line was scratched out, but still faintly readable. DARC Labs opposes. Requests retention of samples for further research. Emma set the page down and looked at Ethan. They knew it was dangerous. That's why the project was shut down. But Dark Labs didn't want to give it up. Ethan furrowed his brow, spinning the now empty soda can from that morning between his fingers. Then why leave it here? If it was that dangerous, why not destroy everything? Emma shook her head slowly, her eyes clouded with unease. Maybe they ran out of time. Maybe they were planning to come back. Or maybe someone thought it was too valuable to lose. I don't know, Emma said softly. Maybe they planned to come back. Or maybe they figured no one would ever find it. But if these seeds leak into the environment, they could destroy everything. Fields, crops, the entire ecosystem around here. She stared at the metal box on the table like it wasn't just a relic, but a ticking time bomb. Ethan stood and walked to the window, looking out over the dry, lifeless cornfield beneath a thick gray sky. So what now? You gonna tell someone? The authorities? Emma hesitated. She didn't trust the local police to handle something like this, and after that electrician showed up yesterday, she had a sinking feeling they were already being watched. Not yet, she said. I need to understand more. If Dark Labs still exists under a different name, I want to know who they are, and why they left this behind." Ethan turned back to her, worry in his eyes, but no argument in his voice. "All right. But be careful, Emma. I think we're in deeper than we thought." She nodded, holding the box and the documents close to her chest, determination settling into her bones. She had to find the truth. She had no idea that at that very moment, hundreds of miles away in Virginia, Morrison was listening to every word through the bug hidden in the livestock shed. He sat in his office, sipping whiskey, a cold smile curling on his lips as Emma's voice echoed from the tiny speaker on his desk. "She found the seeds," he muttered, taking another sip, his eyes gleaming like polished steel. Greenwood now had confirmation. Emma Summers didn't just know about the hatch. She had the very thing they needed. Morrison set down his glass and picked up the phone. "Assemble the team," he said to his assistant. "If she won't hand it over, we'll take it by other means." He ended the call and looked out the window, already calculating the next moves. Redwood 3 had to end up in Greenwood's hands, no matter the cost. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay in the old bed, staring at the ceiling while moonlight filtered faintly through the curtains, casting a pale glow over the metal box sitting on the bedside table. The wind moaned through the cracks in the cabin windows, sounding less like wind and more like a whisper, a warning she couldn't ignore. She double-locked the doors and checked the latches twice, but the unease clung to her like the darkness outside clung to the fields. The hatch under the barn wasn't just a secret from the past. It was a danger that had followed her into the present. The next morning, just as she finished pouring her first cup of coffee, a strange sound cut through the quiet. Footsteps on dry soil. Heavy, deliberate. Not Ethan. Someone else. Emma stepped out onto the porch, her hand wrapped tightly around a fruit knife she'd grabbed without thinking. She scanned the yard and saw a figure moving silently near the livestock shed. Dressed in a dark jacket with a hood pulled up, the person held something small and metallic, some kind of device. Before she could shout, the figure vanished around the side of the shed, leaving behind a trail of clear footprints in the damp soil. Heart pounding, she ran back inside and called Ethan. Her voice shook, though she tried to stay calm. "Someone was here last night," she said as soon as he picked up. "I just saw footprints near the shed. Can you come over? Right now?" Ethan arrived 20 minutes later, a hammer in hand and a tense look on his face. Together they scoured the area around the shed. That's when he spotted it. A small metal device, no bigger than a coin, tucked into a hidden corner of the wooden wall. "A bug," he said quietly, yanking it out. "Someone's been listening to us." Emma stared at the thing in his hand, feeling the blood drain from her face. "The electrician?" she whispered. "He wasn't here to check the lines. He planted this." Ethan nodded grimly and slipped the device into his pocket. "I'm taking this to the cops, but Emma, if they're bugging your farm, that means they know. They know you found the bunker." She didn't even have time to respond before the low rumble of car engines echoed from the dirt road leading up to the farm. This time 2 vehicles. One, a local police cruiser. The other, a gray SUV with no license plates. 3 men stepped out. 2 in police uniforms, and 1 in a gray suit and dark sunglasses, holding a leather briefcase. They walked up to the gate, and the suited man raised a stiff hand in greeting. "Ms. Summers? I'm Agent Carter from the Department of Defense Historical Unit. This is Sheriff Haynes and Deputy Miller. We've received word of potential Cold War remnants on your property. May we speak inside?" Emma glanced at Ethan, her eyes narrow with suspicion, but she nodded and led them into the house. In the kitchen, Carter sat down at the table, setting his briefcase on top with a quiet thud. His voice was calm, but carried a steely undertone. "We've been informed that you discovered an old facility beneath your barn. If that's true, it's considered government property. You need to seal it immediately and allow us to conduct a formal investigation." Emma crossed her arms, trying to stay composed. "I didn't report anything. So how did you find out?" Carter offered a tight, unreadable smile. "Rumors travel fast around here. But if it's part of the Redwood Project, it falls under the DoD's jurisdiction. You're not authorized to retain or handle any of it." Ethan cut in, voice sharp. "So where have you been for the last 50 years? That thing's been buried here forever." Carter gave him a sidelong glance but said nothing. Instead, he opened the briefcase and slid a sheet of paper across the table toward Emma. "This is a temporary order. You're to seal the hatch and cease any further entry until we obtain full legal authorization." Before Emma could respond, another vehicle pulled up outside. The same black SUV from the day before. And stepping out was none other than Morrison. Dressed in a dark gray suit, his slicked back hair glinting under the cloudy sky, Morrison entered the cabin with a smirk that looked far too prepared. "Apologies for the intrusion," he said smoothly, holding up a badge. "I'm Morrison, security advisor from Greenwood. I'm here to assist." Carter's eyes narrowed. "Greenwood? You have no jurisdiction here." Morrison calmly placed his ID on the table. "We were formerly known as Dark Labs, a research partner on Redwood 3. I'm simply here to ensure everything is handled properly." Emma's stomach twisted at the name. She stared at Morrison, her voice tense. "Greenwood is DARC Labs?" Morrison nodded, his eyes sharp as glass. "Correct. And if you've recovered anything from the site, we have a vested interest." Carter stood, tone rising. "That interest ended when the project was terminated. This is DoD business now." Morrison shrugged. "There's no formal court ruling yet, Mr. Carter. Until then, we request a hold on all action until we confirm ownership." Carter's jaw clenched, but he didn't argue further. He turned back to Emma. "Seal the hatch. We'll return soon." He motioned for the officers, and the three men exited, leaving behind an oppressive silence. Morrison remained, turning toward Emma. His smirk was gone, replaced with a hard, threatening stare. "Miss Summers," he said quietly, "I strongly suggest you cooperate. Greenwood doesn't want complications, but we will do whatever's necessary to protect our investment." He walked out without another word. Emma stood frozen, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. Ethan stepped beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. "They're fighting over it. The government wants control. Greenwood wants to steal it." Emma nodded slowly, her expression darkening. "But I can see it now. Greenwood doesn't care if it's dangerous. They want those seeds, no matter the cost." She turned toward the metal box on the bedside table, the weight of it pressing into her thoughts like a storm building on the horizon. She realized she was caught between two giants, one chasing control, the other ready to use force. In Virginia, Morrison sat behind his desk, listening to the final seconds of the bugged recording before Ethan had torn it from the wall. He now knew Emma had the seeds, and he knew Carter wouldn't wait long before returning with a full legal order. But Greenwood wasn't about to wait either. He picked up the phone, his voice glacial. "Send the team tonight. If she won't hand them over, take them." He ended the call and sipped his whiskey, eyes flashing with ruthless resolve. To Morrison, Redwood 3 wasn't just a handful of seeds. It was the key to Greenwood's future domination of biotech. And no one, not Emma Summers, not the Department of Defense, was going to stand in his way. The sky over Kentucky had turned nearly black by late afternoon, thick clouds rolling in as the wind tore through the brittle cornfields, making the dry stalks rustle like they were whispering warnings. Emma sat in the dim kitchen, arms wrapped around the metal box containing the Redwood 3 seeds, eyes locked on the window as darkness swallowed the farm. After the confrontation with Carter and Morrison, she knew time was running out. The government would return with a warrant. But Morrison, his chilling gaze still fresh in her mind, wasn't going to wait that long. Ethan stood by the sink, still holding the hammer he'd carried since morning. His voice was low, steady. "I don't like the way that guy looked at you. He didn't come here to talk." Emma nodded slowly, setting the box on the table, her fingers drumming on the cold metal. "He wants the seeds. Greenwood doesn't care how dangerous they are. They just see dollar signs." She stood and grabbed a cloth bag from the cupboard, carefully placing the box and the Redwood 3 files inside. "I'm hiding it. If they show up tonight, they won't find it easily." Ethan didn't argue. He followed her to the livestock shed, where she dug a shallow hole beneath a pile of hay and buried the bag, patting the earth down gently. By the time they returned to the house, night had fallen completely. The only light came from the soft glow of the cabin's windows, flickering faintly against the overwhelming dark. Emma double-checked the locks on the door, though she knew if Greenwood really wanted in, a padlock wouldn't stop them. Around 11 p.m., a sound sliced through the stillness. Not the wind, but a sharp clink of metal on metal, like someone prying open the hatch. Emma shot up from the couch, her hands trembling as she grabbed a flashlight. Ethan, seated by the door, tightened his grip on the hammer and signaled for her to stay quiet. They killed the lights, held their breath, and listened. Footsteps, soft but deliberate. More than one. 2, maybe 3 figures, moving around the barn and the shed. Emma whispered, her voice shaking but resolute. "They're here." Greenwood Ethan nodded, his eyes fixed on the window. Through the slit in the curtain, they saw 2 dark figures, one holding a small flashlight, the other something shaped like a gun. Emma's heart clenched, but there was no time to panic. She rushed to the phone and dialed the sheriff's number, but got nothing but static and a hollow beep-beep. "They cut the line," she said, turning to Ethan, panic rising in her throat. Before he could answer, a dull bang echoed from the barn. The hatch forced open. Emma dashed to the back door, grabbed Ethan's arm. "We have to get the seeds. We can't let them take it." They slipped outside, crouching low to avoid the flashlight beams sweeping across the yard. The wind whipped across the fields, cold and sharp, tugging at Emma's hair. They reached the shed. Emma dropped to her knees and clawed at the hay, fingers scraping against the dirt until she found the buried bag. Her hands shook as she pulled it free, but just as she stood up, a cold voice rang out behind her. "Don't move, Miss Summers." She turned slowly to find Morrison standing under the pale moonlight, dressed in a black coat, a handgun trained squarely on her. His expression was hard, almost mechanical. Behind him stood 2 other men, one with a flashlight, the other holding a coil of rope. Ethan raised the hammer, but Morrison's gun didn't flinch. "Don't be stupid, friend. Hand it over. No one has to get hurt." Emma clutched the bag to her chest, eyes blazing. "You don't understand. These seeds are dangerous. They could destroy everything." Morrison stepped closer, a cruel smirk curling at his lips. "I understand better than you think. Redwood 3 is Greenwood's future. Drought-proof, ultra-productive, worth billions. Environmental risk is just part of the equation." He extended a hand, the other still gripping the gun. "Give it to me, or I'll take it another way." Emma stepped back until her spine hit the shed wall, breath shallow but voice unshaken. "I'm not giving it to you." "You won't be able to control it," Emma said firmly. Morrison's brow furrowed, impatience flashing across his face. He motioned for the man with the rope to move in, but before anything could happen, A voice shouted from the direction of the barn. "Drop the weapon!" Floodlights from a police vehicle blazed on, illuminating the entire area. Agent Carter stepped out, gun raised, flanked by 2 local officers. Morrison turned, fury flickering in his eyes, but he didn't fire. Instead, he slowly lowered his gun, that cold smirk returning to his face. "You're too late, Carter," he said smoothly. "I'm just retrieving Greenwood property." Carter advanced, voice sharp. "That's DOD property now, not yours. Take them in." The officers rushed forward and tackled Morrison and his 2 men, pinning them to the ground. Emma exhaled shakily, still clutching the bag tightly to her chest, though she knew this wasn't over. Morrison was in cuffs now, but the look he gave her wasn't defeat. It was a promise. Greenwood wasn't done. Carter walked up, voice steady but firm. "Ms. Summers, hand over the bag. Redwood 3 has to be destroyed." Emma hesitated, glancing at Ethan, then back at Carter. "I'll give it to you, but I want to make sure it never ends up in hands like his again." Carter nodded and held out his hand. "You have my word. This comes straight from the Pentagon." Morrison was being escorted to the police vehicle, but before the door shut, he turned back, speaking just loud enough for Emma to hear. "You think this is over? Greenwood doesn't give up." The police cars pulled away, leaving Emma and Ethan standing alone by the livestock shed. A cold wind blew across the field, and she shivered. Carter stayed a few minutes longer, checking the barn, and then instructing an officer to tape off the hatch. "We'll be back in the morning to finish the job," he said before heading off. Emma and Ethan went back into the house, sitting quietly on the sofa, the adrenaline slowly fading. She looked at her hands, still trembling, and whispered, "I never thought it would go this far." Ethan put a hand on her shoulder, voice calm. "But you stopped them. That seed didn't end up in Greenwood's hands." Emma nodded, but her heart was still heavy. Morrison wasn't the type to walk away quietly. And Greenwood had the reach and resources to try again. She knew she had just survived something dangerous, but the cost was dragging her quiet farm into a war she hadn't asked for. The next morning, pale sunlight broke through the clouds, but the air was still thick, as if the storm from the night before hadn't fully passed. Emma stood on the porch of the cabin, holding a mug of cold coffee, staring out at the field. The signs of intrusion were still there. Tire tracks in the dirt, broken boards near the shed, and the barn's sealed hatch marked with police tape. She hadn't slept at all. Her mind kept turning over the same questions. Would Greenwood come back? And had she done the right thing handing the seeds over to Carter? Ethan sat on the steps, his hammer resting beside him like a new extension of his arm. His eyes were tired, but alert. "What do you think they'll do with the bunker?" he asked, voice hoarse from lack of sleep. Emma shrugged, setting the mug down on the railing. "Carter said they'd finish the job, but after last night I don't trust anyone." She hadn't even finished the sentence when the sound of engines rumbled up the dirt road again. This time, 3 vehicles, 2 black government SUVs and a small truck hauling equipment. Agent Carter stepped out of the first SUV, followed by a tall man with salt and pepper hair, dressed in a sharp black suit, eyes sharp as blades. He approached the gate and gave Emma a stiff nod. "Ms. Summers, I'm Agent Williams, Department of Defense. This is an official order to inspect and neutralize anything related to Redwood 3. May we proceed?" Emma nodded slowly, her gut still wary, and led them toward the barn, where the hatch remained sealed. Williams wasted no time. He motioned to the technicians to bring their equipment. His voice was deep and commanding. "Redwood 3 is a matter of national security. Nothing from that site can be allowed to remain." Emma crossed her arms, looking him straight in the eye. I handed the seeds over to Carter last night. But I need to be sure it never ends up in Greenwood's hands, Emma said, her voice steady despite the weight of the moment. They almost killed me for it. Agent Williams didn't look away. He nodded once. I know what happened last night. Morrison has been detained. But Greenwood won't back off easily. That's why we're here. To end this, once and for all. He turned to Carter and gave the order to inspect the bunker. The technical team began unloading equipment, the sharp clatter of metal echoing through the silent barn. But before they could enter the hatch, another black SUV rolled up, tires crunching the gravel. Morrison stepped out, uncuffed, composed, carrying a leather briefcase. His trademark cold smile hadn't faded. Emma's hands clenched into fists. She turned sharply to Williams. Why is he free? Williams' jaw tightened as Morrison approached. What are you doing here? He snapped. Morrison raised one hand in mock politeness. I represent Greenwood, the successor of Dark Labs, your former partner in Redwood 3. We have partial ownership of the intellectual property involved. I'm here to observe. Williams stepped forward, blocking his path. That contract was voided when the project was terminated. The research was funded by the Department of Defense. It belongs to the government. Still smiling, Morrison opened his briefcase and pulled out a sheet of paper. This is a copy of the 1974 agreement. It clearly states that DARC Labs retained rights to the intellectual property developed. Greenwood is the legal successor. You can't destroy it without our consent. Williams snatched the paper and scanned it quickly. His eyes flared with anger, but he didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to Emma. Ms. Summers, what did you find in the bunker? Emma hesitated, caught between two forces. She glanced at Morrison, then back at Williams. Seeds, documents. I gave the seeds to Carter, but the files made it clear. Redwood 3 posed a serious genetic risk. It's not safe to keep. Morrison stepped in, calm but with a darker edge. That's your opinion. Greenwood has the technology to perfect it. High yield, drought resistance. We're talking about solving global food crises. Destroying it means destroying the future. Williams rounded on him, voice like ice. You already crossbred it with wild species during tests. People died in a village near one of your facilities. Don't lecture me about the future. Morrison's smile faded slightly, but he didn't argue. He simply raised an eyebrow, as if this had all been anticipated. Emma stepped forward, voice firm despite the pounding in her chest. I don't want to hide anything, but Redwood 3 could devastate the environment. It has to be destroyed, and it has to be transparent. Williams gave her a sharp nod, then turned to the technicians. Proceed. Destroy everything in that bunker. Morrison raised his voice, more forceful now. You don't have the authority. I'll sue the Department of Defense. Unfazed, Williams motioned to Carter. Then sue. But Redwood 3 ends today. Carter stepped forward, leading Morrison away. The Greenwood executive didn't struggle, but his eyes locked on Emma's with a silent warning. This wasn't over. The technicians worked for over 2 hours, retrieving broken instruments, faded documents, and anything else remaining in the lab. All of it was placed into metal containers and incinerated on-site under Williams's supervision. Emma stood quietly, watching the flames rise, the thick black smoke spiraling into the gray Kentucky sky. She felt both relief and emptiness, a weight lifted but also a truth buried. When the bunker was finally sealed with concrete, Williams approached her one last time. You were right to hand over the seeds, but Greenwood won't stop. If they come back, call me. He handed her a card, then left with the convoy. Ethan stood beside her, eyes on the smoldering remains. So, it's over? Emma didn't answer right away. Her gaze lingered on the smoke, drifting like ghosts above the field. I'm not sure, she finally said, voice quiet. Morrison isn't the kind who gives up. She turned and walked back into the house, collapsed onto the sofa, hands gripping her temples. The battle was won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like surviving a storm with another one already forming on the horizon. In Virginia, Morrison sat in his office, phone pressed to his ear, voice cold and precise. Find another way. Redwood 3 was destroyed, but the documents have copies. Prepare the legal team. We're taking it back, no matter the cost. He ended the call and stared out the window, his expression razor sharp. Today was only a setback. Greenwood was far from finished. The night after Williams left, the farm was once again swallowed by silence. Only the sound of wind whispering through the brittle cornfields broke the stillness, and the pale moonlight shimmered over the fresh concrete, sealing the bunker beneath the barn. Inside the cabin, Emma sat in the kitchen, clutching a mug of lukewarm tea, eyes fixed on the window, feeling equal parts relieved and hollow. The Redwood 3 bunker was gone, the seeds destroyed. But Morrison's last words clung to her like a shadow that refused to leave. Ethan was asleep on the couch, his hand resting on the hammer beside him, his breathing steady in the stillness of the cabin. Emma was about to get up and clean her cup when she heard it, a faint clink of metal against concrete. Not the wind, deliberate, intentional. She froze, heart skipping a beat, then bolted over to Ethan, shaking his shoulder. "There's someone at the barn," she whispered urgently. "They're back." Ethan snapped awake, grabbing the hammer, eyes groggy but sharpening fast. They switched off the lights and crept to the window, peeking through the curtains. There, beneath the moonlight, was a shadowed figure in black, crouched over the sealed hatch, a crowbar in hand. The glint of a small flashlight flickered across the ground. Emma's breath caught. That gait, she knew it. Morrison. But this wasn't the polished advisor. This was a man unhinged, desperate. She grabbed her phone and dialed the number Williams had given her. He picked up almost instantly. "Morrison is at the hatch," she whispered. "He's breaking through the concrete. You have to get here." "I'm on my way," Williams replied. 20 minutes. Keep safe." But 20 minutes was too long. By the time the call ended, Morrison had already cracked open a small hole in the concrete, just enough to reach inside. Emma and Ethan knew they couldn't wait. They slipped out the back door and cut around the livestock shed, hoping to flank the barn before he could retrieve anything. But they were too late. As they neared the barn, Morrison turned, moonlight catching the wild glint in his eyes. He was holding a small plastic bag with a few dark, waxy seeds inside. The same seeds everyone thought had been destroyed. "You just don't learn, do you, Summers?" Morrison rasped. He reached into his coat and pulled out a handgun. "Greenwood needs this, and I'm taking it." Emma stepped back. Ethan raised the hammer. But before either could act, Morrison turned and bolted into the cornfield, heading for a waiting black SUV parked at the edge of the property. "Stop him!" Emma shouted, sprinting after him, Ethan right behind her. The wind sliced across the fields, tugging at her hair and clothes as they chased the man who'd nearly torn their lives apart. Morrison was fast, fueled by obsession. But as he neared the SUV, 2 sets of headlights blazed to life from the field's edge. A pair of government SUVs roared forward, halting abruptly. Agent Williams stepped out, gun raised, voice thunderous. "Drop the weapon, Morrison! It's over!" Morrison skidded to a stop, panting, eyes darting from Williams to Emma. He didn't lower his weapon. Instead, he lifted the seed bag high, like a final play. "You don't get it, Williams. These seeds are the future. Billions in profits, the power to control global food. Greenwood will win, no matter what you do." Williams stepped closer, tone cutting. "You killed 12 people in the Grayson Village field test. I've seen the reports. The mutated plant spread uncontrollably. You let that happen. And tonight, it ends. Morrison sneered. But the moment shattered when 2 officers rushed from the second SUV, tackling him to the ground, disarming him and prying the seed bag from his hand. He thrashed, shouting, "You can't do this! Greenwood will sue! We'll bury you all in court!" Williams didn't even blink. He signaled to have Morrison loaded into the car, then turned to Emma. "You called just in time," he said. "He found a few seeds our team missed. That's on me." Emma was still catching her breath, hands on her knees, her voice a whisper. "Burn them. Now I never want to see them again." Williams nodded. Under the cold moonlight, a technician dropped the bag into a steel bin and set it alight. The flames crackled, casting shadows across the field. The pungent smoke curled into the sky like the last breath of a nightmare. Morrison, now restrained, turned one final time before the car door shut. His voice was venom. "You'll regret this." Then he was gone. Silence returned to the farm, broken only by the whisper of the fire and the ragged breathing of Emma and Ethan. They stood together in the field, the last traces of Redwood 3 turning to ash behind them. But in Emma's chest, the weight lingered, not just of fear, but of knowing she had stepped into a war far larger than she ever imagined. And though the fire had gone out, its embers might smolder in the dark for years to come. Williams stayed behind, overseeing the technicians as they combed through the bunker one final time to ensure nothing had been missed. Then he gave the order. The site was to be filled in completely. A backhoe from the transport truck rumbled to life, and as the sun began to rise over the Kentucky horizon, the last traces of Redwood 3 were buried beneath layers of soil. By morning, the once feared hatch was nothing more than a flat patch of earth. No sign of what had nearly changed their lives forever. Williams walked over to Emma, handing her a small envelope. "Compensation for damages to your property. It's not much, but enough to repair what was destroyed. Greenwood's about to be hit with a major scandal. Files from the 1975 incident are being leaked to the public. Morrison will be prosecuted. That company won't be back." Emma took the envelope, but didn't look inside. She nodded, her voice tired but steady. "I'm not in it for the money. I just wanted it to be over." Williams gave a short nod, then climbed into the SUV with his team. As the convoy disappeared down the dirt road, Emma and Ethan stood in the quiet, the hum of engines fading into the distance. The farm was finally still. Back inside the cabin, they grabbed shovels and set to work, patching up the holes around the livestock shed. Dirt clung to their hands, but the weight on Emma's chest slowly began to lift. For the first time in days, the air felt breathable. "There's still a lot ahead," Emma said, her voice lighter now. "But at least we're not in the middle of some twisted corporate conspiracy anymore." She smiled, truly smiled, for the first time in what felt like forever. Ethan nodded, clapping her on the shoulder. "You kept your integrity, and you kept your farm. That's everything." They stood there for a while, side by side, watching the morning light spread across the fields. The corn was still dry, the barn still battered, and the house still needed fixing. But the land was theirs again. The danger had passed. And Emma's dream of building an organic, self-sustaining farm was still alive. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but it would be hers to walk.